Hey everybody, I'm here to talk to you today about journalism, ethics, and the philosophical origins of ethics. This is going to be a complicated subject, and I'm going to try to go into as much detail as possible without boring you to death. And there will be opportunities for you to ask questions, and we'll do follow-ups, and we'll do all of that stuff online, of course. And I will post details about how we can do a Q&A. I'm still trying to figure out how we're going to assess these things. And I'm trying to figure out how we're going to do our mock trial. But for now, I'm worried about you guys getting the information. And so let's proceed to the philosophical origins of ethics. Before we get started, I want to first ask if any of you are familiar with what's called the trolley problem.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible.
Now, this scenario was pretty effectively depicted on the NBC show The Good Place, which is a great show if you like comedy, but also a great show if you like philosophy. But anyway, take a look at this clip.
Maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do?
I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Make a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky. On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian worldview...
Okay. So, what did we learn?
Set aside the trolley problem for now, and let's instead delve into sort of the origins of philosophy. Let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle is, as you can see, he's from a very long time ago, born in 384 BCE. That's before the Common Era. And he had a lot of things to say about philosophy and ethics, but the main thing that we're going to focus on is his discussion of a concept called the golden mean. For Aristotle, virtue was located between deficiency and excess. What Aristotle argued is that we have virtuous traits, and these virtuous traits, you can have a deficiency, you can have not enough of these traits, right? Obviously, like honesty is probably a virtuous trait, and a deficiency of honesty is just called lying, right? But Aristotle also thought that you could have an excess of honesty. It is possible to be too honest. Like when your friend who just got dumped wrote a bunch of really kind of terrible, low-grade romantic poetry and asked you what you think. And I think we all agree that the right thing to do in the situation is to say, wow, you've done a really good job of showing, how terrible this heartbreak is for you. What would not be ethical is for us to say, wow, don't ever write poetry again. Your poetry sucks. Find a new way to express yourself. Even if the poetry's terrible. We wouldn't say that. It's not ethical. So you see what we mean by an excess of honesty. You could have an excess of other virtues too. We might all agree that charity is a virtue, right? It's good to help people who have less, to give them things, to help them out, to feed them, to clothe them, to help them when they're sick, and to give them money when they're broke, right? That's charity. That's considered a virtue. A deficiency of charity is called greed, right? We don't want to help those people. We don't want to help anybody. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, etc., etc. But could there be such a thing as an excess of charity? Sure. Let's say you get home from school one day, if school were actually in session, and you find out that your parents have decided to be very charitable. They've given away all of the family's possessions. They've signed away the deed to the house. They've sold everything and given all the money away to charity. And they say, hey, guess what? We gave away everything. Now we're poor. you would probably agree that was an excess of charity because they deprive themselves of, and you, of the critical things that you guys need as a family to succeed, like a home, transportation, food, clothing, etc., etc. That would be an excess of charity. So there's a concept called temperance, and if you have started learning about the Prohibition movement in the United States in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you know that there were some organizations called like temperance societies. And what that meant was to temper something is to take it and find a nice medium point, right? And so temperance is a way of saying not too much. Let's take it easy. Let's not overindulge. So a excess of this would be indulgence. A deficiency of this would be abstinence. And Aristotle has a lot in common with other great philosophers, such as Buddha, who argued that the path to enlightenment is not through abstinence or indulgence. The path of enlightenment is through temperance. The Buddha did not say, don't ever eat food. He said, eat what you need to eat, and then that's it. Like, don't overindulge yourself, but don't completely abstain from the necessities of life either. Another example is courage. We consider courage a virtue. A deficiency of courage we call cowardice, but an excess of courage we call recklessness. We want people to be courageous. We don't want them to fly off half-cocked and do something that's going to unnecessarily endanger the rest of us. So you can see what we mean by an excess of courage, an excess of this virtue. So hopefully this makes it clear what Aristotle was saying when he was talking about how virtue lies in the middle between deficiency and excess. There's a virtuous path down the middle. Aristotle focused on the person and the situation. If you were to present an ethical problem to Aristotle, the first things he would want to know is, okay, who are you and what exactly is the situation that's happening here, right? He wanted to know less about what you were going to do, what the outcome would be, and more about who you were, because he thought that virtue depended on your station in life. Aristotle was kind of a snobby elitist who thought that society should be organized into different levels. That at the very bottom we would have slaves, and at the very top we would have kings, and everybody would sort of find their level somewhere between royalty and the very lowest level of slavery, or peasant workers or serfs or whatever. So if you were to ask Aristotle, how can I be good? He would have an answer that I think is not very helpful. It's helpful as sort of abstract advice, but it's not helpful for resolving specific moral dilemmas. He would say that human excellence, habits, and character lead to good actions. So in other words, it's kind of a circular thing. What is it to be a good person? Well, good people are those who do good actions. Well, how do we know what good actions are? Good actions are the things that good people do. It doesn't make a lot of sense. We still don't define what good or virtuous is. We just sort of say good people do good things. Good things are the things that good people do. It's not very helpful. So the golden mean for Aristotle is this virtuous path right down the center. It was a way of approaching ethics to say that you would find this sort of virtuous middle path where you indulged in, or not indulged, but you exercised just the right amount of virtue. You would be courageous, you would be honest, you would be temperate, but not too much. But not too much. So think about this in terms of journalism. Certainly we would think that honesty is a virtue for journalists. Is it possible for journalists to be too honest, to give us too much information? We would also agree that challenging power is a virtue for journalists. Is it possible that journalists could be too skeptical of power or could challenge power too much? Can you have an excess of this sort of philosophical, institutional skepticism of power structures? All right, let's move on to Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative. You'll notice that Kant lived a whole lot later than Aristotle. Kant was a European philosopher here in the 18th and 19th centuries, 1724, 1804. And Kant's great insight was that virtue is unchanging and that moral choices should be universal. You see, Aristotle thought that because we had different layers of society, that different people in different castes or social sections of society would have different responses to moral dilemmas. For example, in Aristotle's mind, bravery was an important virtue for a soldier, but not for a slave, right? Honesty was an important virtue for a servant, but not for a spy. Strength and dominance could be an important virtue for a king, but not for a spouse or a wife, more specifically, because Aristotle was kind of a sexist. Does that make sense? Kant, on the other hand, said that virtue shouldn't change. A course of action is either right or it's wrong, period. And it doesn't matter what layer of society you live in, that these moral choices ought to be universal. And this idea of Kant's was called the categorical imperative. And he had a very complicated way of phrasing it, but the way I'm going to phrase it for you is the categorical imperative tells people when they're facing a moral dilemma that they should choose the course of action that they would want everybody to choose under all circumstances forever. Now, you all know what the golden rule is, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat people the way that you want to be treated. Kant and the categorical imperative went a little bit further to say not only should you treat people the way that you want to be treated, but you should treat other people the way that you want all people to treat all other people at all times forever. And that's why I call the categorical imperative a hyper golden rule. It's not because, look, no professor of philosophy calls the categorical imperative the hyper golden rule. I just came up with that term to sort of point out that it has similarities to the golden rule. It's not the same. It actually goes much further. As part of the categorical imperative, Kant believed that moral duties could not be given waivers. There were no exceptions. There were no opportunities for you to say, well, normally this would be the right thing to do, but, and then give yourself an excuse to not do something, right? So if honesty is the best policy, you can never tell a little white lie. When your friend comes out and says, how does this look on me? You can't say, oh, it looks great if it doesn't look great, right? You have to say, that's not very flattering for your figure. That's not very good for you. You have to give your honest opinion. There's no exceptions. If your grandmother knits a sweater for you for your birthday and you pull it out of the box and it's the ugliest thing you've ever seen, Kant would say you cannot lie to your grandmother and tell her it's beautiful, I love it, I'll wear it every day, etc., etc. You can't, because there are no exceptions for moral duties. Also, Kant, through his categorical imperative, argued that we should never treat people as a means to our ends. We should always consider them their own ends. Like, people exist for their own reasons. They don't exist just to serve us or help us or be a stepladder on the way for us to achieve our goals. That people are their own entities who should be treated as ends unto themselves. In other words, people have their own reasons to live and to exist. We don't have any philosophical reason. We don't have any grounds upon which to treat people as a means to our ends. Because, think back to the hyper golden rule, we would not want to be treated as means to somebody else's ends, right? We don't want to be a step on someone's ladder to the top. We don't want to be someone that they discard when they find, a better spouse or romantic partner. We don't want to be a means to somebody else's ends. Therefore, we cannot treat people as our own means to an end. Kant focused on your actions, not you, the actor. His number one question was, what is it that you're going to do? why are you going to do these things? One way to phrase the categorical imperative is that the means justify the ends. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. What matters is, how did we get there? Did we do the right thing? If we did the right thing, then whatever happens at the end, we are sort of morally unassailable, because we can say we always did the right thing. We made the right choices. We did the thing that we would want everybody to do when faced with that situation. And so to lie means that if you lie, you're basically saying it's okay for everybody to lie all the time. If you steal, you're saying it's okay for everybody to steal all the time. So even if your family is starving, if you slide a package of lunch meat into your pocket at the grocery store to feed your starving family, what you are in effect endorsing with this moral failure of theft is to say that it's okay for everybody to steal at all times, right? The categorical imperative says you should act in such a way as if your behavior would become a universal law. So I'm going to use some clips from this Quentin Tarantino movie, Inglourious Bastards here. First, let me show you one of the scenes that opens the movie with a Nazi hunter of Jewish people interrogating a French farmer.
Now, my job dictates that I must have my men enter your home and conduct a thorough search before I can officially cross your family's name off my list. And if there are any irregularities to be found, rest assured there will be. That is unless you have something to tell me that makes the conducting of a search unnecessary. I might add also that any information that makes the performance of my duty easier will not be met with punishment. Actually, quite the contrary. It will be met with reward. And that reward will be your family will cease to be harassed in any way by the German military during the rest of our occupation of your country. You're sheltering enemies of the state, are you not?
All right, freeze. So, Kant would argue under the categorical imperative that it is not morally okay for the farmer to lie in this situation. Because by lying, the farmer basically says that it is okay for everybody to lie all the time. And this is a common critique of the categorical imperative, is that it does not grant moral exceptions. Even if your action, although technically good by telling the truth, would lead to a greater moral indignity, right? If the Nazis are at your door and if they're saying, do you have any Jewish people hiding here? And if you say yes, you're telling the truth. Good for you, Immanuel Kant would say. But you know what's going to happen. If you tell the truth, the Nazis will then come inside and round up the Jewish people that you hid in your attic or basement or whatever, and then they will take them to a concentration camp where they will die.
Il me semble que nous en avons terminé. Ah, mesdames, je vous remercie pour le temps que vous m'avez consacré. Nous n'ennuierons pas votre famille plus longtemps. Donc, monsieur, mesdemoiselles, je prends congé de vous et je vous dis adieu.
Which I think we would all agree is a greater moral atrocity than lying to the Nazis. But under the categorical imperative, there's no distinction between the different moral wrongs, right? Kant thought that morality was universal. There was no moral distinction for Kant between one type of moral slip-up and another type. Let's move on to utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill. As you can see, John Stuart Mill was a whole generation past Immanuel Kant. And the main contributions of Mill was this idea of utilitarianism, also known as consequentialism. Mill thought that virtue lies in the goal that creates the greatest good. So in other words, Mill was less worried about how you got to the goal than in the ultimate outcome of your series of decisions. So Mill would say, you can lie to the Nazis when they come to your door asking you, are you hiding any enemies of the state? Mill would say, yeah, lie to those guys. You're going to create a greater good, or you're going to create less harm if you lie to the Gestapo about whether or not you know of any Jews hiding in the neighborhood. So for Mill, utilitarianism was about whatever action results in the greatest good for the greatest number, or, as I said, whatever action results in the least harm for the least number of people. So that was how he defined utilitarianism, is whatever maximizes the greater good or whatever minimizes the greater harms that are caused to lots of people. Utilitarianism has nothing to do with you personally. People can't be utilitarians to talk about, well, this maximizes the greater good for myself. That's not how it works. It's about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, not just what is the best good for me. Does that make sense, everybody? So Mill was focused on the goal, not the acts leading to the goal. Whereas Aristotle was focused on the person and the situation, right? Like Aristotle would want to know, are you a soldier? Are you a slave? Are you a king? Before you can answer questions about what you would do in a certain situation. Kant would want to know, what actions are you taking? Morality is universal. Either you do the right thing or you do the wrong thing. There's no other choices. It's either a right action or a wrong action. Mill was focused on the outcome. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Does it lead to a better world or not? And so where Kant would say that assassinating a dictator would be wrong because murder is wrong, Mill would say assassinating a dictator is good if it leads to a better world, right? Certainly you can imagine a world where assassinating a dictator would just lead to even more severe repression of the people by the state, right? The dictator's replacement would come through and be even more cruel and brutal and vicious than his predecessor. Well, then you've created a much worse world. Another way of thinking about Mill's philosophy is the ends justify the means, right? Whatever outcome is, if it's a good outcome, then it doesn't matter how we got to this good outcome. So this fundamental struggle between philosophers, where we talk about what the rules are and we talk about what the outcomes are, is the big struggle in a whole lot of fiction, right? Especially a lot of superhero thrillers, action movies, science fiction movies, right? You have this bad guy who's doing terrible things, but he's got this wonderful goal in mind, right? Look at Thanos in the Avengers. Thanos wanted to, according to him, save life. Thanos' argument was, if we let the universe continue down on this path, it will lead to poverty, misery, overcrowding, chaos, and violence. What I want to do is delete half the universe's population, and then people can return to living in peace. In his mind, Thanos was a utilitarian. The ends justify the means. The Avengers, on the other hand, said, no, it's wrong to kill half the universe. It doesn't matter what your goal is. The more important thing is the actions you're taking to get to your goal. So the Avengers were Kantian categorical imperative followers, right? Murder is bad, genocide is bad. It doesn't matter what your goal is. The actions you're taking to get to this goal are morally unconscionable. Thanos must be stopped. Make sense?